Hello everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started now. Hopefully everyone can hear things just fine. And on the next slide, we'll show you a couple tips for how you can make it a little bit easier to see. Jen, can you advance the slide one? All right, great. So just really quick before we get into the presentation, there's a couple of tips that can help you out when viewing this. If you change the view everyone, which is located at the top center of your screen, to hide everyone, you'll get a much better view of the slideshow. It'll be more full screen and you won't see any names at the top of participants. And then there's also a chat function over on the right-hand side towards the top. It's kind of a little bubble box, and you can use that function for submitting any questions, and we'll try to answer questions as we go along through the workshop. And then the other tip that it looks like everyone noticed how to do is to mute your microphone, which is the green button down towards the bottom of your screen, and then you can turn off your camera down there as well so that it takes less bandwidth for you to view the presentation. So my name is Megan Ademeyer, and I'm a conservation planner with the Clallam Conservation District. I am having some technical difficulties today, though, and my internet has been giving me some problems. So my coworker, Jennifer, is actually going to be giving the presentation today, but I'll be going through all the questions that come in. So feel free just to pop any into the chat box as you have them, and we'll go ahead and work through this workshop. So Jennifer, I'll go ahead and give you the reins now.
Great, thanks Megan for that introduction. So like Megan said, I'm Jennifer Bond and I'm a planner here at Clallam Conservation District. Megan and I have both worked for the district for many years, providing technical assistance to horse and livestock owners in Clallam County. I'm going to be kind of running through the presentation today, but like Megan said, if you have questions or you feel like you have something valuable to add during the talk, just feel free to pipe in at any time. So just quickly, a little information on kind of who we are and what we do in case you don't know. Conservation districts are nationwide, so every county across the country has a conservation district, and they're all set up so locally we're focusing on issues in each county that are important to our farmers and residents of that county. We provide assistance to land users to help protect and conserve natural resources. We are not regulatory. All of our services are free of charge. We are not associated with the county. We do partner and work with the county, but we are a special subdivision of state government, kind of like a school district. We are primarily grant funded, and we get most of our grants through the state and a couple of federal sources as well. So tonight we're going to be talking specifically about getting ready for winter, which is just around the corner here. So the topics that we're going to be going over are preparing your outbuildings. So we'll be talking about gutters and downspouts, lighting, snow removal. We're going to look a bit more at stock watering options, talk a bit about feed management, and we're going to try to focus specifically on a couple different livestock types, kind of the common livestock types that we see throughout the county. And then how to deal with mud, that's a big topic. Megan and I did a webinar last week. The recording is available on some tips for constructing what we call mud-free paddocks. So we're not going to get into a lot of detail this evening on that topic, but there is a recording and a technical guide for helping folks through that, and we will touch on it later. And then we're going to just talk a bit about manure management as well. So let's get started. So for one thing that Megan and I routinely do when we go out and meet with folks on their property is the first thing that we'll take a look at is, are there gutters and downspouts on your outbuildings? And this becomes really critical because, as you can see in that little diagram, 1 inch of rain falling on a 1,000 square foot roof produces about 625 gallons of water. So if you think about our rainfall, especially, we are pretty wet during a very short period of time. So starting about now through early spring, that's a lot of water that's coming off the roofs. Even a very small shelter or a run-in shed is going to produce a significant amount of water. And that's clean roof water that we want to keep out of these livestock areas. So we recommend you install gutters and downspouts on your outbuildings. And you need to come up with a good plan for what to do with that water as it comes off your barn roof. And so usually you want to drain that roof water into a vegetated area or into a dry well, but you want to get it out of those areas that are heavily used. So you don't want it heading towards a barn or heading towards a walkway or a roadway. And like I mentioned, that's clean roof water. So, you know, if that's running through a really muddy kind of winter feeding area and then down into a ditch or into a stream, that clean water has now been polluted with bacteria and sediments. And we were trying to keep this water as clean as possible and keep it from causing a water quality problem somewhere else on your property. So, so if nothing else, if you don't have gutters and downspouts on your sheds and barns right now, just put that on the list and try to get that to happen, because that will make a huge difference for just keeping mud down and making things a bit easier for you this winter. So if you do have gutters and downspouts already on your structures, go ahead and just take some time now to clean the leaves and debris out of the gutters. You know, especially once we get into some freezing weather, if you have water that is kind of ponded up and trapped in that gutter and then it expands during freezing, it can cause you know, a lot of problems with that whole fascia board and the gutter kind of failing altogether. So I was out to a farm the other day, great farm, but they had actual trees growing in the gutters, so of a large barn, and so not going to be ideal. So, you know, definitely, I said, get that on the list of things to go out and take care of right away, so you can keep that clean roof water out of your livestock pens. And then also, and this is something I've experienced, especially with my cattle, like they like to rub on the downspouts. Horses will get bored and mess with them. So try to be creative with your fencing to keep the animals away from downspouts. I've had pretty good luck, just even running the downspout through a larger PVC pipe to just add kind of an extra layer of protection, because the steers especially seem to like to scratch on those downspouts and crush them.
Jen,
so,
yes. Sorry, can I interject with a question really quick? So we had a question about whether the water could be diverted into a cistern for livestock. I know we didn't put a picture of that up, but do you want me to talk a little bit about the project in Clallam Bay that we did?
Yeah, if you want to mention the Clallam Bay one, and then I don't think I put a picture of a downspout diverter in there, but yeah, let's talk about a couple of those options.
Okay, yeah. So we have done a couple different projects with folks. One of them is out in Clallam Bay with an 1,100 gallon cistern that they elevated on a 24-inch high pad. And they were able to take all the roof runoff from 2 barns and put it into that 1,100 gallon cistern, and then gravity feed it down into a stock tank that had a float valve. So they had water pretty much all the time. Since it's Clallam Bay, it's mild weather and it didn't freeze very often. So that was a wonderful system for them. And then there's also a landowner, well, there's several landowners that we've worked with, but one that comes to mind down in the Agnew area that installed downspout diverters on their gutters from their outbuildings. And the downspout diverters are really neat because you can attach a float valve to them on the stock tank, and then the downspout diverter, it will divert the water into either the dry well or the stock tank. So once the stock tank's full and the float valve kicks it off, that water will actually go back down into your regular downspout and then out into a dry well or some other location that's away from your livestock areas. Jen, did you have something more to add for that?
Really, the only other thing I'll add is we've had a lot of folks kind of over the years direct, like Megan said, roof water into a stock tank or even into a rain barrel, which is great. We like that more on the like metal roofing. It's there's some kind of mixed science out there on the safety of using roof water for drinking off of composite roofs. So kind of keep that in mind as well. If you're in an area where you have a lot of seagulls or pigeons and you have a lot of bird manure on the roof. There's been some studies that show that that roof runoff water can be pretty high with fecal coliform bacteria. It can cause some problems for your livestock. So kind of keep that in mind, that the cleaner the roof, the better. And then finally, you still, if you're directing, like Megan said, with the downspout diverter, you're definitely, if you have a stock tank kind of just sitting there at the end of your downspout, or a rain barrel or something along those lines, that's one storm event is easily going to fill up that sort of catchment system. So you absolutely still need to have an overflow system in place. And there, we have some information on how to install dry wells, but basically the dry wells are just kind of an excavated pit, backfilled with drain rock, and covered, and you would just direct your downspout into that dry well. It works okay for most soil types. If you have very poorly drained soils, or a very high groundwater level during the winter, then it's best to try to just direct that roof runoff overflow into kind of a low area, because sometimes the dry wells will just kind of fill up and flood. So so I don't have anything else to add specifically to that. In the webinar we did last week, which we have the recording of, or last month, excuse me, which talks about the heavy use areas and building kind of these mud-free paddocks, we do have a couple slides on these downspout diverters, but I had never heard of them until I visited the farm that Megan mentioned in Agnew. If you just Google downspout diverter, you can order them online, and they're super clever. I think they're a great way to capture and use roof runoff water, but make sure it's not going to cause a problem once your stock tank or your cistern is full.
Oh, I thought of one more thing to add, Jen. If you have a roof that is like a composite roof that has the moss resistant material in it, it can be really high in copper, I believe it is, and it can cause quite a bit of trouble with sheep. So metal roof, as Jen mentioned, is typically going to be the safest one to use.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Jen.
So moving on to kind of outdoor lighting. So we're coming up here on very short days. It's kind of one of the challenges of living this far north. And, you know, a lot of times we're doing chores in the morning in the dark. And if we're working during the day and coming home, we're also doing chores in the dark. And so it's really helpful to get some good outdoor lighting installed. There's been some major advances with lighting. The LED lighting is super energy efficient, pretty low maintenance. But this is, you know, we find that this is pretty critical to get good lighting for feeding areas, for areas where you're cleaning. There's a lot of options available, lots of timers and sensors and motion detector light. I personally like the dusk to dawn lighting on the outbuildings. It's providing some security, also safety, and it's super convenient. So I recommend, you know, any of those areas, especially if, I'm just going to back up. The lower picture has a picture of kind of a stall and some run-in sheds. And so we're going to talk later about how the importance of just kind of daily cleaning and kind of keeping up on things around the property just to make your life a bit easier. And so I find that folks who kind of take the extra time and effort to install outdoor lighting in pens that they're trying to clean on a regular basis really just makes the job that much easier. So pens, feeding areas, and especially walkways from your home to the barns and outbuildings, just those are the areas where I think it's great to focus on getting some good outdoor lighting installed. And it's relatively expensive. I just did a quick Google search on Home Depot. Any of the home stores and feed stores have a variety of different lighting options available. So the other thing we wanted to chat with about too is just snow removal. And this has been more of an issue, honestly, in the last few years. One of those pictures with the brown horse with the white blaze, that's my farm. And I just live a couple miles up O'Brien Road. But we've had significant snowfall events in the last few years. And so that stall door, we were cleaning snow off the roof. And, you know, it was a lot of work to clear that stall door to make enough room to get that horse in and out of the stall. But heavy, wet snow, as I'm sure you all know, can be seriously damaging damaging, especially the sort of snow events we get around here where we get a significant snowfall amount, then it kind of warms up and that snow becomes wet. That's when we see these damaging snow loads. And so, you know, we strongly recommend that you get out and try to get that snow off as soon as possible. This can be a very dangerous scenario too. So there are some tools out there and different regions of the country that deal with higher snowfalls. You know, they routinely have these like snow roof rakes and actually services where you can hire someone to come out and clean the snow off of your roof. But you do want to especially be paying attention to the forecast, paying attention to when we're having those warmer temperatures come through where there's a chance that that snow is going to get really wet and heavy, and try to get that cleared off the roof before you start having some structural problems. So the next thing we want to chat a bit about is just stock watering. Our general rule of thumb here at the Conservation District is that you provide stock water for your livestock in stock tanks, and that you do not water livestock directly from ditches, ponds, or streams. Livestock access to waterways can damage the banks, and runoff from manure can negatively impact water quality. Also, slow-moving water bodies like ponds or kind of slow-moving ditches can have liver flukes, which can affect mostly sheep, cattle, and goats, alpacas and llamas too, and a little bit less likely of an impact to horses, but it can be a problem as well if they're drinking directly from slow-moving water. So we strongly encourage everybody to try to water their animals directly out of a stock tank. And there's a lot of different options out there for stock watering, but we do find that the larger size tanks can be really helpful during the winter. When you have that larger volume of water, you're less likely to deal with things completely freezing solid. The picture of the stock tank, the round stock tank there, that's from my farm. That's a gravity fed system from a spring kind of up above that we piped down to a couple different pastures and then set it up so it was easily accessible from a couple different fields for our cattle, and it's been installed on a gravel pad. We keep a pickaxe down there. This is an area of our farm where there's no power, so it's not possible to use a heater, and we're going to talk a bit more here later about tank heaters, but we keep a pickaxe down there so we can just send one of the kids down there to routinely chop ice. But, you know, especially if you're on a well and you are relying on well water for your stock, and then we have a storm event where you lose power, you know, if you don't have a lot of water kind of readily available, you're going to get into a situation when you can't pump more water out of your well. So we recommend these frost-free hydrants. These are, again, readily available at local farm and garden stores or local home improvement stores, and they're designed to provide water even during freezing weather. And so this kind of diagram on the left is just a picture of how the hydrant actually works. Pretty important that you install it, you know, following the guidelines. And then, you know, kind of over here on the right with the picture of the country, it's just kind of looking at, you know, what kind of hydrant you need. For the most part, you know, a 1 to 2 foot hydrant for our area is plenty sufficient. We don't get those extremely cold, extremely long freezing temperatures like other regions of the country, thank goodness. Because you know, you're looking at needing, you know, much more depth to get below that frost line. So usually a foot is good enough for our systems here. This schematic here just provides a little bit more information on how these actually work. And so, you know, I have successfully used these on our farms for a number of years. If you have the luxury of just kind of setting up a farm, put more frost-free hydrants than you think you're going to need. So every spot where you could maybe foresee yourself someday needing to water animals, put in a frost-free hydrant. So this really will just make your life a lot easier. Dealing with frozen hoses and thawing hoses. I mean, there's a point where we're bringing hoses into our house to thaw our hoses. So this, you know, is just a real clever workaround. Megan, do we have some questions we want to work on, or are we still good?
No, we're doing great. Yep. So
Okay,
keep on going. Thanks for checking.
all right, perfect. So I mentioned earlier heating for stock waters. There's a lot of varieties out there that we're going to talk about. There's submersible heaters, floating heaters, heated buckets, and integrated trough heaters. And there's a lot of kind of do-it-yourself information available online for insulating stock tanks. Again, like I mentioned, other parts of the country are dealing with like a lot extreme freezing weather we don't normally have to deal with, though the last few years have been somewhat of an exception. But on this slide, the pictures over to the right just show some kind of do-it-yourself options for actually insulating your kind of standard Rubbermaid or poly stock tanks. So that's kind of one option to help deal with keeping your water system thawed and available. But the submersible heaters, basically those are designed to lie at the bottom of the tank, or you can find some that will directly attach to the drain plug on stock tanks. The cord will basically come up out of the tank that you can plug into. You want to be sure that if you're using these sort of submersible stock tank heaters, that you're always using a GFI outlet to prevent problems. And then you need to also make sure that whatever heater you use, if you're using a poly tank or a plastic tank, that they're not coming in contact with the tank. I can tell you from firsthand experience that it will melt a tank. So definitely, you know, be aware of where the tank heater is and what sort of tank that you're using. And then also cord management kind of becomes an issue too. If there's a way you can position a tank so the cord coming out is not available, especially if you've got curious animals or bored animals that want to kind of mess around with things. You know, there's some clever tips on the internet, but I've had pretty good luck with kind of taping cords out of the way or placing tanks in such a way where the livestock can't get to the back of the tank where I have the cords coming out. These floating heaters are actually better for some of these plastic or poly tanks. So these are going to be a heating unit that's going to sit on top of the water. Every now and then I'll have a calf or something that will try to flip one of these out. But for the most part, once they realize it's not tasty and there's no treats involved, they'll leave it alone. And again, you know, make sure you're plugging it into a GFI outlet. Again, these are available pretty much at any farm and feed store, and you can shop online for them as well. There's a lot of cool things out there as far as heated buckets. So if you've got livestock inside, horses in stalls, sometimes having these heated buckets is just a really great way to make water available and not have to worry about going in there and chipping ice, especially if you're gone for long periods during the day. Still going to need to get water into the bucket, but your bucket will stay free of ice during the day. These are smaller volumes of water, so probably not the best idea to just rely solely on 5 gallons of water. But I find that the buckets with the hidden compartment for the cord storage is the best option, the least likely to get messed around with during the months when animals are bored. And then there's some pretty fancy stock tanks out there as well that are designed to be integrated troughs. And so these are things that we see more in the Midwest or in regions of the country like Montana and the Dakotas where it's really cold. And so they tend to be a little bit more expensive. And there's a bit more involved in the setup of these sorts of tanks, but they're really slick, really awesome, you know, just very low stress as far as knowing that you're going to have a reliable, constant source of water available for your livestock throughout the winter, regardless of the weather conditions. So there are some that have a thermostatic control or adjustable thermostat, and that can be helpful when you're dealing with kind of the electric costs that go along with running a system like that.
Jen, we did have one quick question before we get off the stock watering topic. What to do if your animal shelter doesn't have electricity? Are there any suggestions for that?
Yeah, that is something that I routinely we deal with a lot of folks that buy a place that there's not power. There's not, obviously in the winter, as like things are starting to get wet, running power to these, the long-term solution is to, go ahead, just bite the bullet and invest in running power out to the structure. If this is, that's not feasible, especially during the winter months, it's not feasible to go out there and do some big, installation of underground power. Even just running extension cords can, I'll admit there's lots of extension cords that happen on my farm, just to try to get the stock tanks there. If you are in a situation where you're not going to be able to run an extension cord to get power out there, there are some other tips I didn't include in the presentation that I have used with some success in some of my stock tanks that don't have power. You can throw an old basketball or an old soccer ball in the tank, and that will kind of slowly bounce around and help reduce the formation of ice in the stock tanks. But it basically comes down to, you're probably just going to have to get out there at least daily and break ice on the stock tanks. Megan, do you have any other suggestions for structures without power?
Yeah, I've seen it used kind of with, again, limited success. People burying the tanks even kind of deeper in the ground a little bit, just so they have kind of like the ground to warm them up some. It still usually is going to freeze a little bit. You're going to have to chop some ice in the really cold temperatures. There are some designs, I think, online that use like large tires, kind of like an insulated type of system. And I'm sure we could get some designs for someone who wanted to, look at installing something like that. But we don't see a lot of it around here. I think the majority of people, if they can't get power to their buildings, just use a large tank and chop ice, like Jen mentioned earlier.
Yeah, there are some, when I was doing a little bit of research for this presentation, there's quite a bit of information out there on solar panel powered stock tanks. I am not a solar expert, but there are some good kind of DIY articles up there about how to incorporate a solar panel. And so that might be something that folks could look into. But I do know other parts of the country that have more light during the winter months do routinely use solar power to help with the tanks as well. So that could be an option too.
So we did have a quick comment that someone's been told that filling a couple of plastic bottles with hot water and putting them into livestock and chicken water will help prevent it from freezing, or at least slow it down. And I think that's kind of like the basketball idea that Jennifer mentioned. I have done that. I've put some milk jugs, and I believe I put some salt in it. There's a recommendation to put like salt in it to keep it from freezing, so that they would help keep the water from freezing. And it might have helped it freeze a little bit less, but I wouldn't say it was super successful. The one thing it did help me with is at least I could pull that milk jug out of that frozen spot, and then I had a little bit better area that I could start chopping my ice from, so I didn't have to, start pickaxing a really thick slab of ice. So that can help. You'd have to probably put the bottles of hot water in a lot as well, to make sure that they were, continually moving around, since they get cold quicker. And then, and if you're going to that extent, you may end up just thinking it might be easier just to bring hot water down every so often for the animals.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thanks for sharing that, whoever shared that. So, okay, if there's no more questions on stock tanks and watering, I'm going to move a bit on to winter hay storage. So I'm sure if any of you have experience keeping animals in the Northwest, you realize that hay storage can be tricky just because we have such a high moisture content. It's just very humid and wet here during the winter months. So the best bet is really to store your hay inside a structure. And most folks have try to, use a shed or even an unused area of the garage, if you don't have space or you don't have a barn. If you don't have an indoor spot to store hay, then you can tarp it. You're still probably going to have a bit of damage, but if you try to think about when you're tarping it to do some sort of pyramid stack or something just to help shed rainwater off of the tarp. And then, if you can pull that tarp tight and you can pull the bottom edge of that tarp away from the bales, that will help shed the water off of the pile and away from the hay. Really, your best bet is to try to get your hands on some pallets or some logs that you can elevate the hay up. This is even important inside structures. You're going to have, if you store bales of hay directly on the ground surface, even in a barn, you're still going to have some condensation and probably some mold or rot on those bottom bales, because the key is you want to encourage good air circulation in your stack. And so it's a little bit late at this point if you already put your hay up, but you want to think about trying to leave some space for the bales basically to breathe, so you get some good air circulation. And that's kind of the cool thing about wooden pallets, is it just allows that air to circulate up under the haystack. You can check around a lot of the there's a lot of stores around here that will routinely give away pallets. I know Thurman's in Port Angeles. If you stop in there, they oftentimes have pallets available. So I always cringe when I see people burning pallets, because I think about all the uses that they could have on a farm. And definitely putting your hay up on a pallet is a really easy way to just preserve that bottom layer of hay. And it's also pretty important. You want to, feed out your older hay first. Try to keep the new hay, in a separate area. Feed out the old hay first, and you're just going to save yourself some problems there. This can be, like I mentioned, a pretty challenging climate to try to keep hay in, and especially for long periods of time. So if you have an older structure that you're storing hay in and you're not so certain that the roof is solid, not a bad idea to try to tarp the top of the hay. Again, pull the tarp away from the edges of the bale just to allow some good circulation through the bales to help reduce mold. You want to be pretty cautious when you're buying hay or when you're putting up hay, that you're being aware of bales that are possibly wet. So if you're tossing at bales and then you get to one and it's just super heavy and you're not sure what's going on, kick that one out to the side, feed that one out first, because there are certainly challenges also that go into making hay in Clallam County. Megan and I every few years do a hay workshop, and we get local hay growers to come in and talk about growing hay, making hay, and then kind of matching your livestock feed needs to hay that's out there. But it's pretty consistent that hay growers say it's definitely challenging, especially in certain areas of our country, to dry hay appropriately. So if you're buying hay out of fields that have low areas or wet spots, you may want to stack those bales that are questionable in a different location, possibly in an outside stack. Any questions on hay storage before I move on?
Nope, we're doing good. Keep on going.
Awesome. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to briefly mention is rodent control. And so this is, about this time of year is when people start saying, hey, I've never saw a rat or a mouse in here, and now I've got a problem. And, they're critters that are looking for opportunities. They're looking for habitat. They're looking for a safe, secure space. They're looking for food, and a lot of times they're looking for water if there's not water readily available on the property. So the best way to control rodents is to just eliminate the habitat. So if you have any old wood piles, especially wood piles that are adjacent to your structures, old feed bags, trash piles, or any other kind of piles out and about in your farm area, especially near these structures where you're feeding livestock and you're keeping feed, it'll go a long ways if you can just get rid of those secure spots that rats and mice like to to use for habitat. So they don't like to be exposed. They don't like to be in the open. So they're going to look for paths and areas where they have some cover. So try to reduce the piles, and especially old feed bags and such. And then the other real important part is just how you're storing your grain and feed. And so obviously metal tubs are going to be your best bet because they're not going to be able to chew into those areas. This gets a little tricky. We're doing a poultry talk next week, and a lot of people who are keeping chickens and turkeys and other types of poultry, they have kind of free choice feed available. And so that a lot of times will bring in rats. And so kind of try to keep in mind, place feeders out in the open where the rats have to basically venture across a large open area to get to feed. They're less likely to do that. So, but feed storage is pretty critical. These are pretty clever animals, as I'm sure if you've ever had to deal with them. But your best bet is to just completely eliminate their food source, and that will force them to move on. And then the other, thing they need, just like any other critter on your farm, is they need water. So if you've got a leaky tap, fixing that will definitely help. I've had pretty good luck in just where I position my water troughs. A lot of us will put a tank, along a fence or along a wall, and the rats will, climb up walls and climb up fences to, to access water. So if you, again, place your tank kind of in a more open area where they can't easily climb up and get to the water, that will help reduce them as well. And then of course, just trying to, repair holes, keep your structures pretty sound, block off paths. I mean, if you end up with a rodent problem, and you just kind of go out and watch, you'll see what areas they routinely travel. And then those are the good spots to try to trap and do what you can. But for the most luck you're going to have is just eliminating their food source, eliminating their habitat, and then hopefully they will move on. So these are just some options as far as feed storage. I personally like the metal containers because they're less likely to get into that with a nice secure fitting lid. I've had them chew into plastic bins before, but for the most part, the metal containers seem to work really well. But if you can just keep the lids secure, keep them out of those areas, they'll give up and move on to somewhere else, hopefully. So the next thing I wanted to chat about, and this is a topic that Megan and I get lots of questions on throughout the year, but especially during the winter months, is just mud management. And so, like I mentioned earlier, we get a significant amount of rainfall during a relatively short period of time over our winter months. And so areas that are heavily used, such as roads, gates, trails, water trough areas, livestock pens, those are the areas that are going to be most prone to becoming muddy. And runoff from these muddy areas, especially when they're mixing with manure and urine and sediments, if it's washing down into a stream or a waterway, that can cause pollution and water quality problems. So you need to cover the bare soil to prevent and or reduce mud. And for the most part, when we're talking about these winter management areas and farms, the thing that we have found that works the best is crushed rock. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how to control mud on your farms. So gravel or crushed rock is what we recommend to use kind of in these heavily used areas such as roads, gates, trails, and around the water troughs. It's pretty important that you make sure that you don't have any surface water flowing into these areas that you're trying to dry up. So take a walk during the next rainstorm, look around, where's water coming into this area, and then do your best to try to divert that water before it gets down into your road or into your barn area. I like to have a pile of gravel just sitting there readily available so you can kind of, as problems pop up during the winter, you can easily get to the pile and kind of fill in potholes or fill in low areas. Hog fuel is something that is readily available. For those of you who don't know what hog fuel is, it's just large chipped wood. It's often a byproduct of chippers from a logging operation. And it can be used, but it's usually not as durable as gravel. So when it comes to kind of winter management tips, for horses specifically, we recommend that you remove them from these kind of wet pastures. We gave a fall pasture talk. The recording is available. But basically, our pastures and our soils cannot hold up to use during the winter months. The grass is dormant, just like while you're not having to mow your lawn. And then our soils become super saturated with these heavy rainfalls. And so if you allow your horses and livestock just to have free access to your pastures, you're going to end up with muddy areas, overgrazed pastures, and just a lot of damage to that pasture that you're going to have to go out and fix later. So we recommend that you confine your horses into a confinement area. And then clean that area on a regular basis. We have a technical guide. This is just a picture of it. It's available on our website, and we can send you a PDF of it that walks you through kind of step by step how to build these graveled, mud-free paddocks. It's maintenance is pretty critical on these, and when we get the heavy snowfall and the freezing weather, it's really hard to get out into these mud-free pens and keep them clean. And so you may want to consider locking your horses inside of a stall or a barn where you can easily clean the manure, because what will happen is if you can't clean that manure, it's frozen or it's buried under snow. When everything thaws out, you have kind of a big mess on your hands. And so if you follow the steps in the technical guide that kind of walk you through how to site these areas and how to design these areas and then how to maintain these areas, Megan and I are available to come out, make a site visit, or just even provide you some technical assistance over the phone if you want to put one of these pens in. But from a horse management standpoint, it's pretty critical you have one of these kind of mud-free areas to confine your horses in during the winter months. So here's just
Oh,
yeah,
sorry
go ahead.
just a super quick question about the gravel size. 5/8 inch minus is what we recommend for using pretty much throughout. Like a 6-inch base of 5/8 minus inch is what we suggest. And that heavy use area brochure that Jennifer just showed, we could definitely send that to anyone that would like to have that. So sorry, Jen, I just wanted to hop in with that.
Yeah, no problem. So this kind of schematic here just kind of shows you in a nutshell what we go over in that brochure. But basically the picture on the bottom there with that tarp-like material, that's geotextile fabric. It's also like road building cloth, and that's what you want to use in most situations as the base. And so you remove the organic material, so the sod, any old manure, hay. You install this geotextile fabric layer. It's nice to tuck the edge of that fabric in. In the bottom left-hand picture, it's actually tucked into a trench, or you can use like a railroad timber, a railroad tie to kind of hold the edge of the fabric down. And then you want to backfill, like Megan said, with at least 6 inches of compacted crushed rock. We personally like the 5/8 minus. I've used that with great success on my farm. You can go up a little bit in size as far as rock wise, but the 5/8 minus also seems to be what's most available at a lot of the local rock pits as well here. And so, and then the picture all the way over there on the right with the grass filter strip. So these areas where the horses are living, you're going to want to get out there and clean them on a regular basis, but obviously you can't collect urine and you can't collect all the manure out of these areas. And so for the first few years after you install this, the rainwater will drain kind of down through that footing layer. But what happens over time is it plugs up and clogs up with fine material. You can't clean all the manure off of it. And so instead of getting drainage during storm events through the gravel footing, it'll basically shed off of the top of the area, which is fine. That's why you want these areas to have about a 2% slope just to help get the water to move off the top of the pen. But you need to direct that runoff into a grassy filter strip area. That runoff has bacteria and nutrients in it, which is great for grass, but we want to try to keep that out of streams and ditches and wetlands. These are just some before and after pictures of local farms that have installed these mud-free paddocks. You can see in that top picture a lot of wasted feed, with hay getting kind of mushed into muddy footing. The after picture, they've installed stall mats, which really helps kind of reduce feed waste. And then the bottom picture just shows some different options for pavers around a stock tank. That's actually behind the little sorrel horse. There's a little green box in the downspout, and that's actually that downspout diverter Megan was mentioning earlier. Another example, this is was a really flat area, so they weren't getting a lot of drainage off of the top. So they worked on installing, they had to kind of make a slope to shed water off, and then backfilled with, I think, about 8 inches in this particular operation of crushed rock. Okay, so moving on. Just a few more tips as far as feeding animals. So I'm not a vet, that's my disclaimer. So these are just kind of general guidelines. Always consult with a vet if you're having some sort of issue with maintaining weight or feeding your stock. But for the most part, horses need about 1.5 to 3% of their body weight fed as forage. And so that's about 20 to 30 pounds of hay for a 1,000-pound horse. You need to consider the quality of hay when you're kind of designing or figuring out how much hay to feed, poor quality versus good quality. I will say from a manure management standpoint, which we'll talk about a bit later, if you're having to pump like a lot of just poor quality hay into your horse, you're going to have a lot of material coming out the back end too that you're going to have to clean up. And so, you know, especially during the winter months when it's colder and horses are, you know, struggling a little bit more to maintain body weight, it's not a bad idea to think about feeding a bit of a higher quality hay. The digestion and fermentation of the hay is what's producing heat that helps the horses maintain their body temperatures during the cold weather. So that's why it's pretty important not to cut back on the actual forage. So I know some of the older horses can't do a lot of hay and they're doing more of a senior feed sort of thing, and that's great, but you do want to try to keep hay in front of them just to try to keep their digestive system working, which is going to help them maintain body temperature. And so normally they should be drinking about 7 to 10 gallons of fresh water per day during the winter months. Obviously it's going to be more if they're in a you know, high intensity work program, but you'll definitely notice that their the amount of water that they're drinking will drop off as the weather gets cooler. Heating the stock tanks helps keep them hydrated. They're more likely to drink water that is heated rather than water that's icy cold. Of course, provide them with a mineral block. We are deficient just naturally in selenium here, so make sure that your mineral block contains selenium. And then use a hay bag or a feeder to help reduce hay loss during the winter months. So here's just a few examples of some different feeding options. You know, since we are wet, if you're feeding outdoors, some sort of cover over a stock feeder is ideal. But basically anything you can do to elevate the hay off of the ground surface, which will help minimize hay loss. The bottom left corner is a slow feeder, which a lot of folks have had good success with, kind of mimicking the horse's natural ability to kind of graze periodically throughout the day. And there are folks that do feed round bales too with some success to horses. The main thing is just keeping that round bale dry, so you're reducing the risk of mold and problems with the hay that way. So this is just a few examples of some other options for keeping horses during the winter. This is a local farm that has pretty successfully kept horses on concrete and gravel. You know, concrete can be a very slippery footing, especially during ice and wet weather, but you'll see on that particular farm, it's a kind of corrugated concrete, which helps reduce slipping, but that just really reduces mud and makes cleaning manure up on a regular basis a lot easier. You still want to provide the horse with an area that the horse is a comfortable spot, a sandy spot, or some hog fuel or some mats where they can lie down and roll, so they're not very likely to lay down on the concrete. But just wanted to kind of show you some different options. And then you can see over there to the feeding setup, you know, they're kind of pulling the hay out of the area where the horses and donkeys are, and that will help reduce just the amount of organics and the amount of wasted hay too in these mud-free pens. So we wanted to talk a bit more too about cattle and what to do if you've got cattle. So again, like with the horses, you do want to remove your cattle from your pastures and confine them in some area during the winter to be fed. So either a barnyard, or you can choose a sacrifice pasture, which is basically a high and dry field away from surface water. You can use hog fuel to kind of build up these feeding areas. I've done that on my farm with pretty good success. It takes a lot of hog fuel, not just a few inches. This is like feet of hog fuel. You have to make sure, again, just like with horses, that they have unlimited access to water and a mineral block. And again, using hay feeders will really help reduce hay loss and waste. Cattle are just as picky as any other livestock, and they don't want to eat hay that has manure on it or is super wet or saturated with mud. So kind of keep that in mind. The idea of a sacrifice pasture, again, just look across your farm. You're going to have to fix the sacrifice pasture. It's going to get muddy, it's going to get beat up, and it's going to require that you probably seed it the next spring, but it's better that you just kind of sacrifice one area of your field rather than letting the cattle destroy all of your pasture. So this is just a couple options for, again, winter management. There's a concrete slab with a round bale feeder that you could throw a round bale in. You can get creative with fencing to allow access for different types of livestock. And then over here on the right is a bunker, a feed bunker where the cattle can come up and eat. And again, it's covered, so your hay is going to stay dry, and they're going to be more likely to take full advantage of that versus if it's just kind of out and open and getting wet. So I mentioned feeders, and I really think that these are worth the investment. They can be expensive to get like a round bale or a square bale feeder, but this will really help just reduce feed waste. They can be easily moved around your sacrifice pasture. And just a good way of dealing with winter feeding. They can be used for a variety of livestock types. We'll talk a little bit about that later too, but I'm a big advocate for trying to use feeders. So next, I just want to talk briefly about sheep and goat management. They're not as sturdy as some of the other livestock type like cattle. They really need to stay dry, especially sheep. So they're going to need some sort of protection from rain and wind, so some sort of shelter or cover. You're going to need to, just like with all livestock, increase their feed amount during the winter months because they're going to be working a little bit harder, burning more calories to stay warm. There's a lot of varieties out there or feed recommendations out there, but basically if you've got bred ewes, you should be feeding them about 4 pounds of good quality grass hay and then adding in a pound or up to 2 pounds of corn or grain during late pregnancy and during high levels of lactation. So after they've lambed and they're nursing out their lambs. Again, use hay racks or feeders or nets to help reduce hay waste. A lot of times, most of our lambing operations, they're lambing during the winter months. And so those young lambs are very susceptible to hypothermia. Same thing with kids. And so you need to, most producers or farmers of sheep and goats are using some sort of heat lamp in the winter for their newborns. You need to be very cautious. I have a couple friends that are firefighters, and it's surprising the amount of barn fires they go out to that have originated from heat lamps, whether it be for poultry to help keep hens laying during the winter or just to help keep lambs and goats warm. So be very cautious, but that is something that is probably necessary if you're lambing during winter months. And then again, you need to ensure a constant supply of stock water and a salt and mineral block. So here's just some options for feeders for goats and sheep. A lot of different varieties out there. A lot of it can be kind of a do-it-yourself sort of situation. But again, just like the horses and just like the cattle, they will waste a lot of feed, maybe even more so if it ends up getting wet or muddy. And I wanted to talk just briefly about hogs. Um, they are very susceptible to winter stress. They don't do well if they're cold and wet. They don't have fur like our other mammals that we're keeping on farms. So all swine need a dry and covered shelter, and you're going to need to bed that shelter with either straw or shavings to help keep them warm. I There are some farmers that can successfully keep pigs on pastures during the winter months. I'm not a big fan of it because pigs are very destructive. And if you do pasture them, you're going to have to go out that next spring and basically do a lot of work to fix that pasture, replant the pasture. Could be a good tool if you have a field you want to replant anyway. But they are very destructive, and you'll end up with holes and swampy areas and all sorts of earthwork done by your pigs if you leave them out on pastures during the winter. I prefer that they are kept on some sort of concrete, ideally in a barn or in a structure that can be routinely cleaned. Pigs are naturally clean animals, so they usually will deposit manure in one area, and that's usually away from the area where they're sleeping and eating. And then this gets a little tricky for using automatic waters, but it's really hard to water hogs out of tanks. They're just constantly flipping things over, especially the bigger they get. So I personally like to use some sort of automatic waterer, and I'll show you some pictures in the next slide, and some sort of feed, like a 2-hole pig feeder to help reduce waste. And so kind of the piglets up there on the left are drinking out of an auto waterer. They're very smart. They can figure out how to drink out of those, and you just got to show them that the water comes out. And then you can see some of these hogs are kept on slatted floors, which kind of elevates them up above and keeps them a little bit drier. And as I mentioned, I think that for winter management of pork, it's pretty important to have a hardened surface where you can routinely clean manure up. If you put them just outside in a native soil yard, they'll just destroy it and you won't be able to clean anything out of there. I've only kept pigs once during the winter, and it's a challenging thing to do. So a lot of the breeders here locally, if you're interested in growing your own pork, you can get your piglets, your wiener pigs in April, and then by September, you're usually finished and they've been processed. And so that's a better time frame if you're thinking about getting pigs and you're not a breeder yourself. I would strongly encourage you to not try to keep them over the winter months. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to chat more about poultry next week, but here's just some quick tips. They do need well-ventilated, safe housing. We're going to talk a lot more about bedding and litter in a poultry house, but straw seems to be kind of the go-to. There are heated watering options available. Again, like I mentioned, it's really important from a safety standpoint to make sure that your heat lamps and your light fixtures are not accessible to poultry. And then they do need more feed, like the other livestock during the winter months, about 1.5 times more feed during the winter. And for the outdoor pens, using something like the hog fuel or wood chips works pretty well. So those pens it's really crazy how much mud a chicken can generate, but they will strip all the vegetation out, and you'll have a mud pit for an outdoor yard if you don't keep some sort of cover on that bare soil. So manure management becomes a key piece when keeping animals during the winter. We have a technical guide available on managing manure, but basically you want to store your manure in a covered pile or location on your farm. And this is going to keep the tarp is going to keep runoff and retain those valuable nutrients that are in the manure that you can then put out on your pastures and gardens the next spring. We do operate a manure share program. So those are folks that have an excess of livestock manure. You can get your name added to a list, and then gardeners and other farmers who are looking for manure for their farming endeavors or gardening endeavors can request the list. And then it's just basically up to them and you to make arrangements on getting that manure. These are just a few examples of storage structures. It can be just really a simple pile with a tarp to more elaborate multi-bin composting system or ecology block sort of system. Basically, you want a designated area. Make it as easy as possible for managing manure. So invest in good quality tools and muck carts. Like I mentioned earlier, install outdoor lighting to make your life a little bit easier. And try to stay consistent with it. Don't, go weeks and weeks without cleaning. I tell folks, think of it as your daily free CrossFit program. You go out every day and do your 20 minutes of CrossFit and get your pens cleaned up. And just a few other tips, just kind of gearing up for these winter months is, invest in some good headlamps. I know Costco runs a special starting usually about this time of year for packs of headlamps. So really a great tool to have, just hanging by the door when you grab your coat, grab your headlamp. Obviously insulated waterproof boots. Safety items like gap tracks, which are basically, you can just attach to the bottom of your boot to help reduce slips and falls. Of course, good outdoor and waterproof clothing and hats and gloves. And then just try to set it up to make it as simple as possible. So it just makes you being able to like take a vacation, or in case you get sick and you need a neighbor kid or a family member to step in for you, try to make it as easy as possible, and kind of getting prepared now, taking a walk around your farm, what, tasks can you take on is pretty key to making things run smoothly this winter when no one wants to be out.
Jen, just one quick question before we get too far. Does it matter if the chicken or goose manure is mixed with wood shavings and straw?
It doesn't necessarily matter. If it's inside the coop, what I have found, if you use a deep bedding system, you're going to put like a foot of straw down. And then what I find is if you use a manure fork or a pitchfork and you go in and you fluff that top layer of straw or even shavings, what will happen, works better with straw, but what will happen is the actual manure, the poultry manure, will drop down. And what you'll have left on top is kind of this fluffy layer. And you can just add a little bit more, as it gets wet and soiled, you can add more straw to it. So I like to use straw or old hay in the actual poultry house because that composts and breaks down a lot easier when you go to clean everything out in the spring. But this deep bedding method is what it's called, is basically you're just layering up fresh bedding on top of the manure. So the manure ends up kind of down at the bottom and the fresh bedding ends up kind of up at the top. So that works really well inside the poultry houses. Out in the yards, I find that the wood chips work better. You're gonna have to, every so often scrape all of the wood that's mixed with the poultry manure out and put it in a compost pile. The disadvantage to like wood chips or hog fuel is that it does take a really long time for that to successfully compost and break down. It's a much easier to generate finished compost from like a straw or a hay mixture with poultry manure than it is for a wood chip situation. It can be done, it just takes a lot longer. So inside, hay or straw; outside, something a little bit more durable since it's going to be in the weather. So like a wood chip situation.
And there was a question regarding the odor, I believe in regards to the straw, probably inside.
Yeah, that can be a problem. Where you start having odor issues is when things go anaerobic, and so you've got too much moisture in there. So, you can, like with the deep bedding method, it requires kind of almost daily management of going out there, fluffing the top layer, letting the manure fall down. But if you get into a situation where it's really wet, like you've got a leak in the roof, or you've got water flowing into the area, or you're maybe not using as much bedding as you should be using, it'll get wet. In that situation, you're going to want to scrape everything out and kind of start over. That's why ventilation in poultry houses, poultry manure is just naturally high in nitrogen, and that's why you get that ammonia sort of smell, which is why ventilation is pretty important in these hen houses or poultry houses. So there are some products like Stall Ease or Dry Ease, which you can sprinkle on the bottom that helps kind of bind up that ammonia smell. But for the most part, just trying to keep it dry and trying to keep as much bedding on top is your best bet for combating odors.
Okay, and last question, what about using shavings instead of wood chips?
So shavings I'm a fan of shavings on the inside of things. So using shavings in horse stalls or shavings in poultry houses, anywhere indoors, I am a fan of shavings. I am not a fan of shavings outside just because we have such a high rainfall and the shavings will absorb, and sawdust, the same thing can be said for sawdust here. it'll absorb a lot of the water, and it get very wet very quickly in one rain event. And so I like it, you can use it outside, but I wouldn't use it as the only covering outside. I would still use something that has more substance to it, that provides more ground coverage. So I'd still use a hog fuel as a base, or wood chips as a base, and then you can use shavings on top. But those shavings are not going to last near as long in one rain event, or a week or so. They might be completely soggy and saturated and require to be cleaned out. In a stall or in a covered structure, they tend to work better.
Fantastic. That was the end of those questions. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Okay, great. So just wrapping up, just a bit more about the services that Megan and I provide. We can just come out, make one visit with you, answer some specific questions, or it can be more in depth, helping you develop a conservation plan for your property. So plans typically include a lot of information about your farms, the type of soil, slope, livestock, crops. We do also offer a low-cost soil testing program. So we've got more information on our website about that. And soil testing becomes pretty key when we're dealing with pastures and trying to figure out how to safely use manure on your pastures and how to grow healthy pastures. We also hold an annual native plant sale where we have bare root seedlings available for purchase, restoration grade seedlings, very affordable. And we do a lot of work with natural landscaping as well. And then we offer kind of a variety of restoration programs. We have the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program for repairing and replanting, riparian habitat along streams. And then we can also provide assistance for folks that are irrigating pastures as well. So I know that was a lot of information covered very quickly, but feel free to contact Megan or myself directly. If you're wanting more information on the mud management piece, I just glossed over that very quickly. Check out the recording from our last workshop that we did. That will help you kind of give you a lot of different examples of farms that have done these mud management practices and provide you with specific tips for getting, these heavy use area pens in. And then the stock watering piece of it too, that gets to be pretty tricky if you don't have power. And the one thing I failed to mention earlier, especially for horses, colic is one of the main killers of horses, and it's directly tied to dehydration. And so keeping your livestock well hydrated through the winter months can prevent a lot of problems too. So it's definitely worth the investment in trying to figure out how to provide water that's drinkable to them year round. With that, I'll take any other questions that I may have missed.
Nope, I think we have them all answered. So yeah,
awesome.
I think we can go ahead and conclude. Thank you everyone for joining us and for all the wonderful questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you, everybody.
All right, we're going to go ahead and leave the meeting now, and thank you all for participating. And if you have any more questions, feel free to follow up with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.